Let's go, Lofi Poli Sci coming at you. Michael Pickering here with our good friend Gregory Day, a writer, director, bookseller, and the voice behind HipsvilleAD, the fanatical sect of God, of subculture, and fervent ramblings of all breed of cinematic pleasures. How are we doing today, Gregory Day?
Oh man, I am swell.
Swell. One of those words we don't hear enough. I dig it. I dig it. And my friend, what top 10 movie list do you have for us today? Explain it to those lo-fi listeners out there.
Yeah, so we are going to be doing a top 10 revisionist westerns. And that is a subsection of westerns or that kind of revised that genre, or you can refer to it as alternative western. So it's a group of films starting from the 50s and through the 70s, is like the real big portion of it, but it continues to today, and it's sort of subverting the moral fiber of the classic Western. If you can think about classic Westerns, are like films with John Wayne or Gary Cooper, like Stagecoach or Red River, films that supported the tall tale, the Wild West tropes that we have here in this country, and dealt with more of complex characters and moral ambiguity.
I dig it. I dig it. Whenever you sent me this title, I was like, what does this mean? But now you put it in perspective. I got you, my friend. I got you. Excellent. All right, well, let's jump right into it. What do you have coming in at number 10?
Oh hell yeah! Number 10, I'm picking a very accessible film that kind of get a newbie or a greenhorn into this genre, this subgenre. We're talking about A Fistful of Dollars from 1964. This is kind of a classic now. It's kind of considered a staple of Western, but when it came out, it revitalized the Western as an action movie, and it amped up the violence in Westerns, and it also changed how violence is portrayed, as far as not only the brutality but how swift violence can be. There's no more getting shot in the gut and kind of aching around for 30 minutes on screen. I could see the light sort of thing. It's boom, you're shot, you're dead. This sort of finite view of violence. But this is a film from Italy, and so it was the first country to really own and master the Western outside of America, and taking a whole genre that was specific to America and then reinventing it in this sort of almost fantastical way. It's super stylized, and it's the director Sergio Leone took this TV star Clint Eastwood and made him into a movie star with this film, and then subsequent films, of course, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. But this one it's completely different than other westerns before. It's got this operatic meets mariachi kind of score that changed the way film scores can be made. But when it comes down to it, what's really different about it is that the central character is morally complex. And while he does prove by the end of the film to have some good in him, this is a film that isn't supporting a moral Christian right sort of American expansionist kind of character. This is a character who is in it for himself, who is in it for his own survival and his own greed. And that's what really changes with this film as far as the genre goes.
Yeah, I can see all of that. And I think I have seen this movie. I think it's been a while though. But is this the one where, because I didn't go back and watch the movie, but watching the trailer, I was thinking, I was like, is this the one that Back to the Future rips off the whole iron plate under the shirt kind of gag?
It is, yes. Yes, that
Okay,
is
I
in the
thought so.
climax of this one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think you're right that, how you're talking about you have a morally complex character here. Like even in the trailer, they tell Clint Eastwood, they're like, look, if you're looking for work and you're willing to kill people, you might find some work here. And then he straight up says, I might be looking for some work. Like that's taking, like you said, the whole genre itself of good old boy Western people, John Wayne, and tossing it out there. Would you say, and like for me, whenever I think about Westerns, I definitely put them in two different categories. And I think Clint Eastwood in 1964, for instance, like this, really starts off a new era of Westerns that's distinctly different. You say that's kind of how you're viewing this in this list?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think when we get later on in the list, we're going to talk about some films from the 50s that predate this one. But to me, this specifically the director, Sergio Leone, this is the new chapter in this genre. This is where things definitely change. And then of course it launches the entire spaghetti Western, the Italian Western subgenre of the 60s and the 70s right after this.
I have a question about that later, but we'll save it
Hmm.
for a little bit. All right.
Sure.
Well,
Yeah.
what you got coming in at number 9?
Yeah, so these next two are great examples of the modern revisionist Western. And so our first one we're going to talk about is called Meek's Cutoff from 2010. It's made by renowned filmmaker Kelly Reichardt, who is a fantastic director who does make these devastating portraits of American life. Many of her other films deal with poverty and um, what it's like for women to live in this country under different circumstances, but she takes that sort of all those things that she likes to explore in her films and makes this film about the Western expansion. And this film Meek's Cutoff is about this group of people who are traveling the Oregon Trail, and they get lost. And as the film goes on, there's this shifting power dynamics between the men and the women in this caravan, who are the men will not receive their power or their responsibility, even though they're heading into certain doom, and the women want to take over because they have to survive. So it's this great exploration of the power dynamics between men and women in this sort of survivalist story. But one of the really fascinating things about the film is that all the women are dressed in these period costumes with these bonnets, and so the film is shot in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is almost a square, so it doesn't take up the entire cinema screen, and it reflects the way the women see the world, um, as opposed to this giant, sort of expansive Western. We get to see all kind of like great landscapes and things. It kind of minimizes that view of things, and it goes to support the central characters of the film.
It's interesting. I like the idea of taking the aspect ratio that you're shooting with the actual film to basically be a character addition in your storytelling. That's awesome. I didn't even realize that. Firstly, I will say it's movies like this, which I hadn't seen before, but just looking at the trailer, that I find accurately portray what life would have been like back in the day, that make me 100% sure I would never time travel backwards in time. No way. Only forward, okay? Only forward. That's for damn sure. But for real, this movie made me think of that old ass computer game Oregon Trail. And that's funny. You
Mhm.
said they were traveling the Oregon Trail. And when you started playing that game, you knew people were going to die in your party from like dysentery or whatever. But so I'd never seen this film, even though it came out in 2010. I don't know if I've even heard of it, but the trailer definitely gave me the feel that it was Western, about moving west and taking your family, and that really that move, that decision was a life or death decision. Like there was no getting around it. You were rolling the dice in some kind of way, because you couldn't predict what was going to happen taking that Oregon Trail, for instance. And I can appreciate the realism because, like you said, a lot of the older westerns they lacked realism. I mean,
Yeah,
completely.
absolutely. Yeah, I would say like if this movie was made in like the 40s or the 30s, it would be they probably wouldn't shy away from like illness and things like that, but they would definitely make it a point to say like these white people crossed the plains, they fared the weather, they killed a bunch of Indians to get there, and they're happy in the end. Whereas this film is definitely not about that. It's about how these internal struggles, the power dynamics between the sexes, and does not shy away from is this a good idea or a bad idea that we're traveling to this unknown part of this land.
Yeah, definitely for one of your choices later, I want to ask some questions about the gender power dynamics in the movies for sure. Definitely a couple choices made me think of that one. All right, and
Mhm.
what do we have coming in at number 8?
Yeah, number 8 is another modern film. It's called The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. It came out in 2007. It's a starring vehicle for Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck. Brad Pitt plays Jesse James, the famed bank robber who is sort of been immortalized as a hero or a um, anti-hero in American culture. And Robert Ford is the man who was in his gang who killed him. He shot him in the back. And so there is the historical fact that Robert Ford did kill Jesse James, but this film is really about celebrity culture and how legends are made. And so Jesse James is portrayed in this film as a straight sociopath who is a robber and a murderer, but his legend is growing in the tabloids, and it attracts this young man, Robert Ford, to him to join the gang and want to be around him and be like him. And so Robert's obsession with him gets the better of him, which leads to him killing Jesse James. And so it has a lot to do with celebrity culture, and you can see this time and time again with like John Lennon or Jodie Foster or other celebrities who have to deal with stalkers, and the way that our society values them and creates this dynamic obsessions with them. And so, but this film is a really great portrait of what it might have been like to be around Jesse James, because he's not a moral character at all. He knows that one day his lifestyle is going to get him killed, but he is like he's basically like a gangster, like we would contextualize in later films, or films set in a later time period where he is a killer and a sociopath, and he'll kill anyone who gets in his way. And it's a beautifully shot film as well. So and it's a long movie. So if you're looking to just check out a great film, a western that's got expansive shots of nature and great action segments, but it also kind of deals with toxic celebrity culture and stuff. This would be a good one to strap in for.
Yeah, I have seen this one. It's been it's quite some time since I've seen it, but I do really remember it being a powerful movie. And I do feel, all of what you said, I agree with. I feel like this film is a counter to the romanticized legends of Jesse James, but at the same time, I kind of feel like you're still drawn into the story of Jesse James. Like as the tabloids develop him as a living legend, it's almost like you're watching how America used to think about the Wild West
Hmm.
develop. And I remember as a very, very young child growing up, my parents were big Western fans, growing up on some of those early, early Western films and showing us that, the Wild West was like all this golden age of America and expansion. And it was just like the time where America was becoming American. And it was led by the legends of Jesse James and Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp. And it was just the golden era. But the reality is, the Old West and the golden age that people romanticized was nothing more than US colonization, exploitation, slavery, the raping and pillaging of people and places that were not part of the United States.
Hmm. Hmm.
And at this exact same time in the 1800s, Europe was kicking into high gear, colonizing Africa, doing horrible things to Africans. And at that very same time, the US was doing the exact same thing to Native Americans here. And I think this film does a really good job of deconstructing those folk legends and that romanticized version of the West to help us see that, look, the way things were and how we pictured them in the early 1900s are two completely different things.
Oh yes.
Um, so I really do appreciate the deconstruction of one of the central legends of the Jesse James and the Old West. It was a refreshing take on the Westerns that we grew up with.
Hmm.
Well, excellent, man. Excellent. Let's go ahead to number 7.
Yeah, number 7, we're going back to Italy. Usually, I would try to pair these together, but I wanted to kind of split them up for reasons. Mainly because I wanted to get an access point with the first Italian Western film, but then I want to circle back to this one because this is probably as bleak as a Western can get. And I'm talking about The Great Silence from 1968. This is a Western that just takes everything that's good about people and throws it out the window. It is a nasty Winterset Western about two assassins who are slowly circling each other in this sort of mining town, this little small village. Gets into like corporate greed and who really owns what and who really has power. And of course, it's the wealthy that has the best power or has the most power, excuse me. But this is a nasty, mucky, dirty Western, and it's directed by Sergio Corbucci, who did Django, which is a film I've talked about before
Right, right.
on here. Yeah. And so he is the master of like taking the Western out of the hot southwestern sort of towns and sticking them in these dirty, muddy, wet places that are a little more, like the Central West or North Central West or the Pacific Northwest. Um, and so, yeah, this film is like it came out in '68. It's like the perfect kind of film of that time in the '60s where everything is about as bleak as possible. And this one really just is about as dirty and nasty as westerns can get.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I never saw this one and I never heard of it either. But I do have like a question for you. So it seemed like from the trailer, like one of the main antagonists doesn't talk. Did I pick up on that right? Or it really doesn't talk much?
Yes, so actually the protagonist is the one who doesn't talk,
Okay.
which is also another subversion because you would expect the lethal bad guy to be the silent one who is an efficient killer, whereas the antagonist to him in this film is the one who bloviates and is kind of a wild person. But both of these characters come from different points of view and are both equally dangerous. And whoever wins, either one of them, there's going to down the road, there's going to be more violence in that these people are going to commit, or more stealing or whatever. So either way, whoever wins out of the duel between these two, um, you know, to kind of rip off a cheesy tagline from a trailer, whoever wins, we lose kind of scenario. Um,
Gotcha, gotcha.
yeah, yeah,
Was that Aliens versus Predator?
it is. Yes.
Ah, yes, got it, got it. Okay, anyway, to the movie though. Um, so I think it's a pretty revolutionary idea to have, the hero of sorts in your Western to be the silent type, kind of like the crazy. So because we think of like in modern era, we think of the silent killer, the serial killer, the sociopath, like that one's off the rocks. And here you're saying the hero kind of was the one who takes on that the more quiet tone that you wonder what they are thinking really. But it then also plays out so perfectly to say, whichever one of them wins, it doesn't matter. We're still going to lose because in the old West, the reality was they were all a bunch of murderers in these cases. Like the cycle of violence didn't stop because one person won a duel. The cycle of violence just kept going. Um, and I think that's an interesting portrayal of events and how things went down. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and there's also, especially in Italian westerns, a long history of central characters being hired killers. So they're hired by the government to kill to kill bank robbers or thieves or whatever. But you think about it, the moral implications of that, hired killers are still hired killers.
Exactly. Exactly. No difference in that. And it makes me think of another list we talked about doing about the romanticized mafia gangsters,
Hmm.
and it draws a little parallel. I don't want to go down that rabbit
Yeah.
hole because we're talking westerns.
Yeah.
But what we got coming in at number six?
Yeah, number six, we got a really wild choice here. This is a film from 1970 called El Topo. It's the only true surreal Western that I could think of. It's from.
Hold on, hold on. What do you mean by surreal western? Because I'm asking for myself, but also for listeners too. So what do you mean
Yeah,
by
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. So it's made by famous surrealist filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky. So it's a surrealist film, like the art movement, where it's visually strange, but also kind of going um, after like Christianity and South American governments, and using a lot of the art. Tropes from the surrealists like Dali and Buñuel and other
Okay, okay.
painters and stuff to infuse the Western with these sort of strange and artistic points or whatever or topics or whatever you want to call them. So um, it's a really weird movie where it's not necessarily a Western to the point of like this is the plot of a Western. It's about a gunslinger named El Topo, which translates to the mole, who claims to be God, who is traveling this world, and there's just all sorts of strange people with body um, mutilations and things that are people are cast in the film. But it's a really strange world, which does reflect the hardships of Western life, or more to the point of like South American life, where Jodorowsky's from. Um, but as it continues in the plot, it gets into like the gunfighter dying and the resurrection of Jesus and this sort of cross culture between killing and Christianity and gun culture and the glorification of all that stuff that is in the Western. This is like a scathing, weird movie about all that stuff that is was once considered very dangerous movie. I think like a riot broke out or something at a drive-in when it premiered, and
Damn.
Jodorowsky was I don't think he was ever in any real danger from the government, but governments definitely came after him or wanted to silence him. Um, and this is one of like great art films of the 70s. And he made another film right after this called The Holy Mountain, which listeners may know of. It's a little more famous, but um, Yeah, this is one of the just weirdest and art kind of films that goes into this subgenre.
Now that I hear you talk about that and the surrealism and the different takes on interpretation and things like that, like I see it because there were definitely this trailer started off way different than any of the others, and and I hadn't seen this movie either, but all throughout, like I was like, okay, Western. I was like, whoa, what's going on? Then I was like, Western, Western, Western. Then I was like, wait, whoa, what is that doing in here? Um, it took you for some wild turns. Um, but one thing I kind of wanted to ask you about too, and talk a little bit about
Mhm.
was I also kind of felt now granted, this is just from looking at the, like, 2.5-minute trailer, so the whole film could be different, but I felt from this trailer that the desert was very much a character alive in this story too. Would you say that is or is
A-
not the case?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay,
It's a lot of it takes place in desert. Yeah.
and to me, I find that incredibly interesting because, unless you're from a place that is in the desert or near the desert, like for myself, New Orleans area, no desert. There's water everywhere. You can't escape water. There's just like your shoes are wet half the time you live. Like the desert is very, very foreign to a lot of people.
Mhm.
So when I see the desert as a character in a movie, it just really pulls me in to see the world in a very different kind of way. So I found it fascinating that they used the desert in such a fashion, and that I was able to pull that just from the trailer, and the whole movie is that way. Because the desert, I find one of the most fascinating landscapes on the planet, and simultaneously one of the scariest places on earth. Like, oh man, I remember my first time I saw a tumbleweed and it was blowing past the 7-Eleven. And then I saw a little dust devil that was like 10, 15 feet tall. I was like, this is crazy. I want to go home. Um, no, but that's cool. That's cool. You want to talk a second about how they use the desert and tell us?
Yeah, I would say there's something about the desert, maybe the loneliness or the hostile nature of the environment that fascinates the surrealist. Like you can look at many Dali paintings and see that the desert was present in his paintings. Um, but it also kind of is isolating, and I think the desert, specifically in the western end to this film, separates society from these kinds of characters who are stuck in it. So it transforms people, makes them nastier, makes them more, it elevates their sense of survival, and these sort of things. But it also is, I think, cinematically is just a great visual representation of loneliness or isolation. So you can have these vast plains of emptiness, and then a single rider coming in dressed in black, and it's going to look very iconic. So yeah, there's a lot to offer with portraying the desert on film.
The desert most certainly can make you feel lonely. I spent 2.5 weeks out in a desert in Southern
Mhm.
California. I never want to go back. Like, oh, it was just not going into it. All right, moving
Yeah,
into
yeah, yeah,
your top five, my
yeah,
friend. What do you got at number five?
yeah. So these next two are going to be from the 1950s, and like the era that really spawned the revisionist western, the end of the 50s. And the first choice we're talking about, 40 Guns from 1957. This film and the next film were both by these maverick outside the system directors who did kind of find short-lived um, success in Hollywood, but they made films like these, which ultimately got, made them not all that popular in Hollywood because they were dissecting things and looking at American life in a different way that didn't quite line up with mainstream ideology. So this first film, 40 Guns, is directed by Samuel Fuller, who we talked about previously for his film White Dog.
Oh,
He's
I
very
remember that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, he's very famous for making these subversive genre films, and he kind of jumped to genre. But the western was one of the ones he worked on in the 50s. And 40 Guns is starts off like the normal lawman comes to town. He's got warrants. He's a federal marshal and he's here to collect, or he's here to arrest certain characters in this little town. But he finds in this town there is this matriarch who has 40 hired guns around her, and no joke, the film has 40 guys on horseback around her. And so she's not only the antagonist of the film, but also the love interest. And so there's this sort of strange attraction between the two of them in this little town. But it really gets into these um, feminist Western tropes where it really turns the especially for the 50s turns the tropes of the bad guy on its head by making it a huge star at the time, Barbara Stanwyck, um, as the villain of the film. But she's the most morally complex character of the film as well, because she's both attracted to the lawman, but also shares a lot of his same views on things. And it's also a movie that fetishizes guns. And there is a specific scene in the film where Barbara Stanwyck asks the lawman if she can hold his gun, and he tells her that he's afraid it might go off in her face. So there's all these sort
Damn.
of double entendres in the film, and yeah, it's very pointed to conflating guns with penises, and it's got all this like sort of bent up sexuality underneath all the interactions between the characters, and um, yeah, and Fuller's like a kind of a strange, idiosyncratic filmmaker. So there's always kind of weird stuff going on in the film, but I think the main part of that guns and sexuality kind of go together, which makes this one stand out. But I will say, in the style of this film, if you look at the economic way that it's edited and how fast the action happens on this film, you could see this film from '57 influencing Sergio Leone to revitalize the Western, or to change the Western, just a few years down the line.
There's so much to unpack here. Really, really is a lot that I do want to talk about. And first, I mean, this director was trying to kill off his career long before he came out with White Dog, it appears.
Yes.
Like he was just doing something crazily different. So when you watch
Hmm.
the trailer, if you just know nothing about the movie, and if you're not paying attention, this movie very much feels kind of like, or it's filmed kind of like your classic Hollywood Western,
Hmm.
from back in the day. But then you do get the trope turned on its head where it's the woman who is in charge of the gang of 40 outlaws. And it's like, really? It was like in 1957. I was like, that's an interesting turnaround on the head. Um, but I also wanted to ask you, so it did strike me right off the back when I said 40 guns and the intro of the trailer, it made me think of the story Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. Did the director pull anything from that or was motivated by it? Do you know?
I don't think so. I don't think that really
Okay.
comes into it. No.
Okay, I just wanted to ask because, like I said, I
Mhm.
hadn't seen the movie. So, and another thing I wanted to ask you about too. So, I know we've talked about it before, with black and white versus color film, and The Wizard of Oz coming out in color was like in the 30s, right?
Mhm.
Why then would we have this film in 1957 shot in black and white instead of color?
Well, there was still a lot of black and white films being made up into the '60s. And so
Okay.
while color films were on the uptick, especially in the '50s, because Technicolor was hitting its stride, 40 Guns, what I would say is it leans a little more towards the B movie, and so it may not have
Ah,
been
okay.
given the opportunity to be in color because it wasn't as expensive as some of the other films. Because if you think about color film in the '50s, it was very expensive to shoot. Um, there's a lot of technical aspects that goes into shooting color film, especially back then. But in this one, it is actually a strange case because it is shot in CinemaScope, which is the largest um, aspect ratio you could shoot at the time, which was the we may have talked about it before, but the competition with television in the '50s, where movies were trying to get bigger and bigger on the screen, and so they would shoot these films in large aspect ratios to draw people into the theater. So it's another really strange aspect of this film, is that it's this subversive western, but it's shot in this grand uh, scope where you get to see miles and miles of landscape and these huge faces on the screen. But we're getting into feminism and how guns are related to sex. But there's still a lot of black and white films during this time.
Yeah, I think all the technical stuff is really cool, but I think that you're right about the gender and the sexuality and guns and the romanticized version of the Old West. And even with Hollywood at the time in the 1950s, and you could very much even argue onto today, is still very masculine dominated
Oh yeah.
kind of society for sure.
Hmm.
And to have this film come out in 1957 and they even talk about like the matriarch of the outlaw band. It's a pretty revolutionary idea, and I could see like, especially knowing this director and another film we already talked about, pushing the envelope of what cinema actually talks about in society. In 1957, that's a big deal.
Yes.
All right, take us on to number four, my friend.
Yes, number four is a very similar film. with some different aspects to it. It's Johnny Guitar from 1954. This is a film starring the one and only Joan Crawford in the lead, and it is directed by Nicholas Ray, who is also famous for directing Rebel Without a Cause. So this is a big Technicolor production that is probably the furthest thing away from a traditional large Technicolor production in Hollywood. And when you see this film, it is a grand production, but you can see right away that it's going to be the type of film that the people who paid for it are going to hate it. And so it's this film about this woman who is running a casino on the outskirts of town, and she's a strong, independent individual. She's in charge of her own sexuality and is the boss of her own company. But then the people in the town don't want her there, and they want her to get out of the town. And it's sort of this ultimatum that surrounds the central plot of them wanting her to leave by a certain time. Otherwise, they're going to come and they're going to burn down her establishment. But the film is one of the few things about the film is that the person leading this group of people against her is another woman who is thinly veiled to either be in love with her or is afraid of her own sexuality and sees um, the central character's freedom as a threat to her and her Christian uh, American society that they live in. So she's really leading the charge to have this other woman sort of burned out of their existence. So, like I said, it's in color, but all of the costumes for the townspeople are all in black, so they all have matching like black and white kind of wardrobe. Whereas central character and then her love interest, who is named Johnny Guitar, are in these vibrant colors. And so, getting down to the point about the film is that it came out right in the center of the House Un-American Activities hearings in Hollywood, which, if you're not familiar with that, is the communist hearings where they're trying to weed out communist influence in Hollywood and other parts of American culture. And Nicholas Ray
Whom
was,
Walt
yeah.
Disney was a part of.
um, I'm sorry, was he a part of
He was trying
the
to he was
you support of it?
going after screenwriters unions.
Right.
He was
Yes.
like fighting
Mhm.
communists.
Yes.
He was not a nice person.
Oh yes, sure. And we can go on a whole other tangent about Ronald Reagan being involved in this as well.
Sure, sure.
But Nicholas Ray was either, depending on your sources, either a communist or a communist sympathizer. And so this film, he did not actually see any consequences from this, but many people he knew and loved and respected in the business did. And so this film really kind of is about that, about this single person being ostracized from the society by the people in power in the town. And so this film coming out in 1954, starring Joan Crawford as the lead, and really being about the political climate in Hollywood at the time. This is about as and all that stuff is inside a Western, our most cherished American genre. You can't get more subversive than this when it comes to 50s films.
Oh no, without a doubt. And to because this one coming right after the previous one. So this one is 3 years earlier than
Hmm.
the last film, but it's in color. The last one wasn't. So, like you said, this film would have cost more money to make.
Yes.
Um, and with the political climate in Hollywood itself, everyone going after, the Red Scare, going after communists and whatnot, and accusing people of being communist. And this one coming out as a Western, as you said, you had the railroad talk, you had gambling, drinking, saloons, and those are also stereotypical of the Western, or when you think about the Old West. But what isn't is a strong woman that is a business owner that holds her own against the patriarchy, against a male dominated society. And in 1954, this film comes out. It's, like you said, amazing. But I want to ask you too, because I don't know the Western genre all that well or this time period in Hollywood cinema history. But would you say that strong female roles in Westerns are a rarity, or did they happen more often than we think? I don't know. What's your thoughts?
I would say that they are a rarity. There is a history of like women's films that Hollywood studios would produce, and they're not only like musicals or romance films, but there could be westerns about family dynamics and things. But what we're really getting at here is that Johnny Guitar has women involved in the shootouts and women involved in the action of the movie or driving the action of the film, And when it gets to those certain things, uh, s- uh, such as the action of the film, and the shootouts of the film, and kind of like really driving how this film is going to turn out. That is something that is not typical of the Western before this film.
Yeah, it definitely caught me as, at least in my experience, a
Mhm.
rarity,
Yeah.
to see, and especially like I said before, the idea of a woman business owner too, and also willing to pull out that gun and protect it in film. I can't really recall anything else in that time period that came close to doing what this film does. You know?
Absolutely, yeah, and I will say, it didn't really change a lot after this film. I mean, 40 Guns comes after this film, but there isn't like a huge revolution of female led westerns after this film, or even till today. We have them; they crop up every now and then, but it's still a heavily dominated male genre.
Yeah, I think the only one that really sticks out into my head, I just want to say, Natalie Portman one that came out a few years back, Jane's Gun or something or other.
Hmm.
Um, was a strong female-led Western, but outside of that, yeah, I can't think of any. Let's go ahead and jump to your number 3, my friend. What do you have for us now?
Yeah, so getting down to the top three, our next two picks are going to be the films from the American New Hollywood movement. So films that really get down into the dirty moral complexities of American society through the Western. We're talking the late 60s into the early 70s. We've mentioned this movement before in the past, but as far as the Western goes, kicking off the new movement of American Westerns has to start with The Wild Bunch from 1969. This is a film directed by Sam Peckinpah, who is one of the most famous American Western directors. He's made a lot of Westerns of different styles, but when you get to this one, particularly, it's the end of the 60s, and it's probably a low moral um, consciousness here in America. And is a film that reflects that to a T. It's about these robbers who are um, sort of waiting out the end of their time, and the western, the old west, the time period of the bank robber and the trailblazing hero are quickly fading away. And so they're on the lam, but they're also being chased by one of the former gang members who has been hired by the government and has a posse who's coming after them. And they're seeing all the things slip away from them over the course of this film. They're seeing the invention of the automobile, and there's mentions of the fact that there's this new machine that can fly back east in this country, and these guys really don't see a spot for themselves anymore, and they see that the world is changing, and ultimately they're going to go out guns blazing. It's the end of the era, basically. And what's really famous about this film is the ending. Sam Peckinpah uh, pioneered the use of the double squib, and if you don't know what a squib is in filmmaking, it's the blood um, like explosive that actors wear when faking a gunshot so that their clothes will explode. You'll see the blood come out. It's the
Oh, really?
gunshot wound effect. Um,
So you
and
had, like,
so
the blood pouch stuffed in the shirt type of thing?
Yes. So
Okay.
that's the squib, but Peckinpah he didn't invent the squib, but he pioneered the usage of the double squib so you could see a gunshot wound that enters and exits the body,
Oh,
um,
wow.
making for a highly violent, almost, but also realistic depiction of violence. So you see these people getting torn apart with by gunshots. But what's really famous about this film is the ending, where it is a complete uh, massacre battle with this Mexican army and our heroes who decide, they have to take a moral stance against what's happening in this town, and everyone is just blown to pieces in this gun battle, and it's something you could see then as being very startling, and it's something that obviously influenced many of the endings of Quentin Tarantino's films with how overly violent and bloody they are. And that's really, and not only is this a film where you're looking at someone examining how America is changing, but also you're seeing a film about how, or a film that shows how violence is changing on screen. Because we have Bonnie and Clyde, the film right before this, that has a massive shootout scene. With this one is like 100 times bigger than that one.
Wow, that's incredible. So I see, like, at first I was thinking, like, there was a duality between, life in Hollywood and this movie and what it's telling. But now it's like I'm going to make up a word, triality. I don't know, duality plus one. All right, whatever the word is, come at me, people. It's okay. Um, but so like, at first and I do like the way this trailer opened up. It was just like 1913, the Old West was pretty tamed, and it's like, yeah, by 1913, sure. I mean, we're getting ready for World War One
Uh-huh.
is about to start. And I think it's interesting that it's this film focuses on the end of the Old West, and while this film also represents a distinct breakaway from the golden age Western films that romanticized that era. So it's like saying that Hollywood era is over, and we're going to tell you it's over by showing you the end of the Old West in this film. And then you add to it what you were saying about how it's also revolutionizing the way that violence is portrayed on film. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of meta stuff going on in this film that I think is pretty cool to really think about. Um, but one thing I really did like that really caught me about this one too, and thinking about the time era in the 1913 and the Old West and how the West was tamed. And they show like they have a lot of military shots in there, and they're
Mhm.
talking about police and this and that. And really thinking about the United States going into World War One, but right before, this is the last era that the United States military was used domestically as a police force.
Mhm.
Like after World War One and going into World War Two, and especially after, it becomes illegal to use US military forces on domestic populations. Like outside of a state of emergency, like when the National Guard are called into something, but otherwise, this time period in American history, it's the last, it's the end of it. We never hear about, the US Navy taking out fighter planes on US populations. It's illegal. You can't call the Marines and the Army into the state of California to tame things. It's illegal. But in this time period, the US Cavalry and the US Army were still ordered around to deal with outlaws, but that was like a changing period in time. I don't know. I just found that interesting. That was it. The death of the West. It's an interesting thing to think about and how the world turns.
Mhm.
All
It's
right.
also, yeah, I
Oh,
would say just one last thing is, like, it's also the end of the old Hollywood, right? We talked about this previously, the American, new Hollywood. So this is one of those great um, films that punctualizes like, this is it, this is over.
yeah. I think one of your early lists talked about, 1970s cinema and really how that hops off into quite a different realm than traditional Hollywood. Um, all right. Let's hit you number two, buddy. What you got for us?
Yeah, so number two, also from the New Hollywood era, is McCabe and Mrs. Miller from 1971, who it's directed by Robert Altman, who directed Nashville, film we talked about previously on this list. This is his self-proclaimed anti-Western. It's a film starring Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, who were two big stars of the 70s. And yeah, everything about this film is if you take every box of like what is a traditional Western, and Robert Altman says, okay, we got a great upstanding hero. Check that box off. We have a cowardly grifter as our main character. We have a hot saloon setting. We have a cold Pacific Northwest mining town setting, and just kind of taking all these things and subverting them intentionally. But he does make a really great film out of it. And so it's about McCabe, who comes to this little mining town, and he's a grifter, and he's very charming. And he kind of takes over the town by introducing gambling and opening a brothel in the town and kind of capitalizing on this mining town. But he is doing something great for the town because he is investing in it, and he is allowing it to prosper, and people are starting to move there, and um, it's starting to become bigger than him. But he does become the town's patriarch, even though there's something about him that you don't know if he truly is this great person or if he's pretending to be this great person. But Mrs. Miller runs the brothel, and there's this dynamic between the two of them, not only as business partners and as people who are running this town, but as lovers. And um, she seems kind of like an honest person who's trying to feel out who this guy is. But as things continue to go on, here come the greedy corporations, and they want in on this piece of expanding property, and the money being that's flowing in this town. And I'm not very familiar with how corporations act in the 70s, but it definitely feels like um, a piece of like the big guy coming in and just taking over, or and if you don't want to give in to the big guy, they're going to obliterate you. And so this is a film very much like The Great Silence, where it's just in the dirt and the mud and in the snow, and it feels about as far away from a western as possible. But it does have this great these great qualities to it that Altman really puts in his films, where he has these large casts, and a lot of the audio is done with these different channels, so you can have these large crowd scenes, or like scenes around the table, like a poker game or whatever, where you're not necessarily getting all of the dialogue clearly, but you're getting the feel of the atmosphere and the feel of like what it's like to be around a bunch of people. And so, yeah, if you're familiar with the TV series like Deadwood, this is definitely like a precursor to that, where it's sort of getting into how societies are created, and more so to the point of like the greed and the decaying moral fiber of American society, kind of built into these um, the birth of American towns and so forth.
I like it. I dig it. I dig it. I will say I'm glad you went in depth into it because I had no idea what this film was about. And it's because the trailer, the trailer, and it made me want to ask you a question, like on the more technical and cinema side of it, because other than this story being a Western, it's about a man and a woman. It was made in 1971, but the music had no dialogue in it. It was just, I mean, that the trailer had no dialogue in it. It was just a song
Mhm,
overlaid to the entire trailer.
mhm.
And it felt kind of very Woodstocky to me because 1971 film, which I knew in the song, I was like little
Mhm,
guitar strum, and I was like, so Woodstock. But all I had to go off of was the lyrics and the song,
mhm.
which don't necessarily always tell a story for a trailer. It just depends on the director. But it made me think, I wanted to ask you, you know, filmmakers, whenever you think about how you are going to market a specific film and you're cutting together a trailer and you have the choice, do I just have dialogue? Do I have dialogue and music? Do I just have music? What goes into that choice? Like, why do you think Macabre and Mrs. Miller, why do you think this trailer is made with just music over it?
That's a good question. I don't really know what the marketing behind it would have been like in that era, but I do feel like it does represent the film very well, because the film does have a lot of Leonard Cohen songs in the film. Specifically, and it's another weird thing about the film is that it does have these songs with lyrics played over them consistently throughout the film. Not only so like traditionally, like an old western would have like an opening song
Sure, sure.
and like a ballad, like a western ballad, and then the rest of the movie would only have orchestral music. But this film has all of these folk pieces that predate the film. They're not made for the film, so they're like put into the film. But I could see the popularity of Leonard Cohen, the popularity of the changing taste, popular taste in music, um, being part of that marketing, and signaling to the audiences that this is not your parents western. This is a modern western. This is for the modern age. It's got the cool hip actors in it. It's got Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, who were very popular at the time, especially with younger audiences. um so I guess that would be my answer, as far as like, leaning into the music would be to probably go for a younger audience, than looking at the middle aged to older people for to get them into watch a western.
See, I like that. I like that too, because I would agree with you without knowing anything about cinema like that, because I do think about some of the really older films that you've had on previous lists and some of the trailers that I've seen, like 1940s and early 1950s films. A lot of them would be just straight music and narration over the entire trailer. Like there would be no dialogue at all. But in this one, instead of using narration over the music, you actually use music with words to kind of tell your story of the trailer. I dig it. I like it. I like it how it's also a break from saying, this isn't your parents' Western. I like that. All right. And what is your number one, the top revisionist Western or alternative Western?
Yeah, we're getting to another weird one here. This is Dead Man from 1995, directed by the great Jim Jarmusch. Um, this is a really weird one, but it does hit on a lot of great points about what the genre can offer. It stars Johnny Depp as a man named William Blake, who is an accountant who travels out west to take a job in this town called Machine. But things go south pretty quickly when he kills the son of the patriarch of the town. He has to go on the run, and then he starts to enter some really weird territory, sort of purgatorial journey of his life that involves the poetry of the real William Blake, and how his identity is kind of entwined with that person as people constantly confuse him for the poet. Um, and it's this him traveling through the West, but also he ends up becoming a companion of this Native American who is wandering also through the land, whose name is Nobody, because he does not belong to a tribe, and his life has been um, derailed by the white settlers there, and his identity has been erased, um, and it's this weird exploration of death and colonization and the journey that gets you through your life and into the next one. And it's got these surreal qualities to it that plays on the idea of so much violence and death in the Western, specifically in the genre, and how people wield guns all the time with little consequence. And so yeah, so death is a huge character in this film. You know, it's not really personified by any one person, but it's black and white photography and sort of the weird, stranger moments of the film. It gets into cannibalism and some psychedelic stuff and religious art and things. But yeah, I picked this one as number one because it's just a fantastic look at the West, not centered on any specific kind of American value or anything, but just looking at how weird and wild the idea of being out in this land and the mixing of cultures and the everyday violence and the prevalence of death um, in this genre makes it such a fantastic viewing.
I have seen this one, though I would have never thought about it as a Western or even as just a movie I'd seen in the past, unless you would have brought it up or someone else. Because, I really don't remember a whole lot of the film, but I do remember the transformation of a person being like central to it. And it really makes me think about how a journey, and in this case, the West, and that journey toward the West, it changed a person. And it makes me think of how many people traveled West as one person. But once they were there, or by the time they reached their destination, they were a completely different person. And it makes me wonder, like, how much of that experience of the journey itself ended up inevitably shaping the West into what it was. And to be real, all the horrible things that happened there, you know? Um,
Yes, yes, I would say right. One of the opening things that happens in the film is the witnessing of I don't know what you call them, but hired writers who go out and eliminate the buffalo population. And this character witnessing this outside of the train of here come these guys with guns and just killing these animals just to get them off the land, not only to get them off the land, but to starve the people who eat them and who survive off of them. And so there's all this history and all this mythology we have with this, but what is it? What did it all do? Other than industrialization, it caused a lot of death, and I think that is what the movie really gets at.
yeah, man. Great pick for number one. Totally great
Yeah.
pick. And great list. There you have Gregory Day's top 10 revisionist Western films. And as always, we got a few questions for you. And first off, why this list? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, this list, well, I love talking about genre films, and I think that the Western could be hard to approach, especially for modern audiences or modern viewers. And I want to offer some films that if you're like, okay, there's the Western, it's this huge American um, fiction that we have, this wealth of stories and history to it, but it's all kind of stuffy, and I don't really want to watch racist John Wayne on the screen. But here are a bunch of other ones, and here's a bunch of other weird ways that the Western talks about our society, or other way filmmakers take the tropes and do fun things with them.
No, that's a great point. I really do. I dig it. I mean, basically, you could call like the traditional first wave Hollywood Western movies like one of the great perpetrators of the big lie that was the West that we were all taught as young kids in school,
Absolutely.
and this revisionist wave of Westerns really starts to push in a different direction of about, you know, to where we are today. And now there's the real conversation of Columbus Day. Should that
Hmm.
really be a holiday? Like really,
Right.
really? Um, but it points to the fact that Hollywood was a huge actor in perpetrating that falsehood about that time period in American history. So I dig it. I dig your reasoning for this list. I like it. But let me ask you. So you said genre, just to refresh our listeners' uh, mind on it. Whenever you say like a genre film and then you add it to genre westerns, what do you mean? What are they independently and then combined?
So, I mean, a genre film can mean many different things. So it's films that are not aimed at the mainstream audiences, but are also tied to tropes, especially like exploitation films, where they're dealing more with things that are not of the PC nature, but also violence and sexuality and stuff. Um, so those are things I'm talking about when I just say the blanket term of like a genre film. But genre, as far as like the many different types of genres of stories specific to cinema, there is the big ones, right? So the western, or the romance, or the musical, or the gangster film. Um, and so those are the, sort of the largest genres we have. But then there's or even like the action film. Then there's like the subgenres, which are breaking down into more specificity. So there's, if you have the action film, you have the thriller, and you have the disaster film, and the car movie, and so forth. So that's what I mean by subgenres. So I hope that
Okay.
kind of lays that
Oh
out
yeah,
for
yeah,
you. So if you have
definitely,
any more,
definitely.
yeah, let me know. If you have any more questions about that, let me know. I'm happy to try to break it down even more.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. All right. And I always do like to ask you too. Do you have any runners up? Because 10 films and you're going from what 1954 to current day. That's 70 some odd years. You have a big time frame. Any number 11s you have out there?
Yeah, so I really struggled to try to get them all here and try to find as many weird and different ones. But one I kept coming to, putting it on the list and off the list, was Django Unchained, um, the Quentin Tarantino film, because it is a summation of many different kinds of revisionist westerns. The Great Silence is a huge influence on it, as is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And but it also McCabe and Mrs. Miller. You can see that it is also mixed in there. Just the settings, and the way Tarantino relies on dialogue. But the one thing I didn't really get to touch base on in this list is the Black Western, and that Western specifically draws from blaxploitation westerns, which is not particularly a great example of Black Westerns. Um, but I think Django Unchained is a great way to show Western, because it does have a lot of things at the beginning of the film that do play towards Westerns, as far as the bounty hunters and everything, and like the way that gun violence is shown in the film. But then again, it gets to finally talking about slavery, which most Westerns do not even come close. They don't even bring it up. It's like it doesn't even exist in Western. So Django Unchained, I think, is a great way to kind of entertain you and show you the Western, and then really talk about this other part of our history that is, hugely absent from the legends of this genre that we have.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. How the story of the Old West just glaringly and conveniently omits slavery and exploitation, and not even just with Africans or African Americans or Native Americans, but also with Chinese and Chinese Americans in especially California. Like most of the time, if a Western that I've seen talks about slavery, it's a one or two sentence word, and it's centered around some characters asking, "Who did you fight for, the North or the South?" And that's about it. But it makes it feel like most of the Old West was post Civil War, and that's complete bullshit. Like the gold rush to the West was happening in the 1940s or 1840s and before,
Mhm.
and much of the railroads out in the West were built by Chinese individuals who were sold a bag of goods, which was a bag of lies, brought to America to work on the railroad, and then were enslaved. So, I mean, much of the West was built off of slavery, and you're absolutely right. It does not get talked about almost at all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just the bookseller in me, I have to pitch a book here if you're interested in reading it. It's a novel, a great novel called "The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su." Came out, I believe, earlier this year or late last year. Great Western, plenty of action, plenty of great character development, but centers around the Chinese experience during this time period.
Ooh, I like that. I like that idea because like we just said it's a distinctly different experience. And what's it again?
The Thousand Crimes of Ming Zhu.
Okay, okay. Thank you, man. I appreciate that one.
Yeah.
All right, next question for you. Do you think the Western is dead as a genre in Hollywood today?
No, it is not dead, but it is barely alive. Um,
That's
but
almost semantics, my friend.
no. But you think about it, the film that is getting the most attention during the awards season right now is The Power of the Dog, and is a western. So it is still alive, but it is not it's not as popular as it used to be by by a large margin. Um, but I don't think we're ever going to see it return to its prevalence. I think the just like jazz or rock and roll, it's not what's popular in the mainstream now. But there are small little pockets of revitalizations or maybe even use as a prestigious studio film to produce one-offs. But if you think about it, like Quentin Tarantino and some other filmmakers are the only ones who occasionally will make a western. Even once upon a time in Hollywood, a large portion of that film, if you've seen it, is western. Um, so yeah, it doesn't. It's not dead, but it is. It is largely marginalized.
Well, then a follow-up question. Do you think do you think any of the dispelling of the myth about how the Old West was great, do you think any of that has anything to do with marginalizing it as a genre?
I think so. Yeah, I think our way our culture has changed. We're not really interested in that mythology anymore. Uh, and if you think about it, like the Western came out, and then the gangster film came out in the 30s. The Western kind of goes all the way back to the beginning of cinema. So even in silent era, there are westerns, but the gangster film really kind of takes over as over time as our American character in film is the one that people really are interested in. And I think our obsession with capitalism and and greed and consumerism and stuff in that genre has taken over what is probably our staple genre in America. Um, but I think it's really looking back at the way westerns have been taught to us, the way that they don't necessarily tell the truth, and the way that they don't
Right.
or for so long hadn't done that. And I think a lot of with this revisionist error, um, to maybe helped kill it to a certain way because it it showed the emperor without its clothes on. But I do think there are many great things you could still do with the western, um, but maybe not. Maybe it's not as maybe there aren't that many great things left to be done with it, as opposed to other things that are relevant to our culture today.
Follow-up to that. Okay, so we talked about Italy and spaghetti westerns a little bit today, and we've talked about the influence of Western in other countries besides that and other lists that you've done. And what I wanna ask is, are Westerns alive in other countries' cinemas right now, or in their like, their equivalent of Hollywoods? Do you get the kind of feel that Western is still barely hanging on as a US thing, but it's doing better overseas somewhere? Or, what's your kind of feel on it internationally?
Well, today probably not, but it still has its influences. Places you could see, it's they're not these some examples I'm going to throw out there are not necessarily the most fresh examples, but you could see things like The Good, the Bad, and the Weird from Korea, South Korea, is sort of a Korean remake, action remake of The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. You have many martial arts films that take influence from westerns. But I think instead of like refashioning the western and keeping sort of the landscape and the look of them like the Italians did, I think other countries have taken the strong silent characters and the action filmmaking of those things and incorporate it into their cinemas, into their genres that are specific to their cultures. It's I think it's kind of an outlier that Italy took this very American genre and stuck with the look of it for so long, to tell stories that take place in another part of the world that they produce so many of these, um, but they elevated it to this ambiguous sort of America in their films, um, and not many, or I would say no other country really did this. Other countries did produce westerns or like uh infuse them with like especially in Japan where you have like the Eastern Western where there's sort of this back and forth between the cultures, but other than Italy, no one really took the Western and started to replicate them um, like they did.
Yeah, I was always curious about that because we have talked about Italy and spaghetti westerns before, but never really sure how big of a thing it was in comparison because U.S. cinema culture tends to think of itself as the one all be all of cinema cultures in the world, and that's
Mhm.
so U.S. centric. And in many ways, that's very much an early Hollywood Western centric view to take, about itself. Like Hollywood is the biggest, the baddest, and here are our westerns, and they're the best. And it's this myth. Well, the fact that Hollywood is the grand cinema operator of the world, it's a myth as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it makes sense to me that Westerns aren't a thing across the board, across the world. It definitely makes sense.
Yeah, I will just throw a shout out to two films by one of my all-time favorite filmmakers named Rainer Werner Fassbinder. In the '70s, he made this film called Whitey, which is about this antebellum family and the like sexual tension between them and their slaves. And he made this film in Germany. It's all in German, but he shot it in like one of the Western sets that Leone used for his Clint Eastwood films. Um, but then he made a film after that called Beware of a Holy Whore, which was about the production of that film, which is about waiting around in a Western town to shoot the movie. And it's this sort of demoralizing tale of what it's like to make a movie. But it's all these people, the crew, the actors, the director, all hanging around in this Western set as they're just slogging through the production of this. So I think those two films together are also a great way to look at how the world perceives the Western and um, it as a genre and it as costume, as opposed to really addressing the real issues that America has with its racism. And yeah, so those are two really great flicks to give a shout out to.
That's interesting. And like you said, while the US in many ways, and especially in the South and in the West, they romanticize the era of the West and of slavery and things like this. But the rest of the world, when they make a movie about it, they're like, what are y'all romanticizing? Y'all were doing horrible things. Like
Yes.
really, no joke. Like y'all are horrible people. So yeah, I mean that makes more sense to me as representing that time period abroad rather than them taking the romanticized version of the Western. Most certainly. So
Mhm.
all right, and a last question, or really two questions for you, and then we'll be done with it all. Why is this list specifically important to you? And then the follow up, why should other people view this list as important to them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge genre film fan and or just film fan in general. So the Western means a lot to me as far as how great some of these movies are, whether they're from the original period of cinema or of the Western, or if they're from the revisionist period. There's a lot of great films, whether they're just tales or whether they're character studies, or whether they're enforcing or subverting the tropes of these films. But yeah, so to me, the Western is one of the best, or not one of the best, one of the greatest um, fictional genres that we've created in this country. And there's a lot that can be said about our country and our history through that genre, um, both for good and bad, as we've seen over the course of this cinematic history we have in this country. But why I think people should watch these films is I think the reason I chose this list was because I want people to be able to have that window into the genre and not kind of lump them all together. And I think it's easy to just dismiss them because of how traditional the genre may seem, or may always be about cowboys and Indians or cowboys and robbers or whatever. Um, but there's a lot to be said about our country and many different aspects of it and many different aspects of people and what the West did to this to the world basically and how many different people see it. So um yeah, I'm hoping, if you're interested, if you're listening and you're interested in watching westerns, I would say, this is the birth of the modern western in a lot of these films that we mentioned here. And it never was the same again. So I don't think after the '70s we really went back to that traditional western. And so, yeah, I think this would be a great place to start if you're interested in getting to the Western, but don't want to have to kind of sit through some of the older, outdated values that could be in some of the older ones.
Racist views, let's just say it. Yeah, the race. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
well,
straight
more
up.
than that, yeah.
Um, yeah, who wants to
Yeah.
sit through that shit? And but at the same time, if you still want to get way into what life might have really been like these films, great choices and opportunities to look at.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
thank you so much. Superb stuff coming at you right there, Lo-Fi listeners. And Gregory Day, before you take off for the day, tell the good people at home where they can find you on the webs and what you've been working on lately.
Yeah. So if you go over to baddate.substack.com, you can find my blog there where I talk about genre cinema. Right now, I am slowly rolling out the Real Revenge um, series that deals with revenge cinema, which is not really its own genre, but it kind of is its own uh, genre within exploitation cinema. So lots of different things going on there with revenge. So check that out. And then you can find me on Instagram at HipsvilleAD. That's my handle there. And of course, if you want to email me if you got any questions about movies, if you want to talk movies, or if you got any questions about stuff we talk about on this podcast, you can email me at hipsvillead@gmail.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much, my friend, for coming on. And that's Hipville's AD Top 10 list. Check our friend Gregory Day out online and follow him everywhere, people. Interested in writing the show? Follow us on YouTube, Instagram, myself on LinkedIn. Email us, let your voice be heard. And definitely check out LofiPoliSci.com. Always got stuff coming up at you on the air. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. And talk to you soon, Lofi listeners. Pickering and Day, signing off.
Adios.